And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, thank you. Mr. President, there's a lot of talk today of an embargo, and indeed there is one. It's staring us all in the face. It's the embargo the Cuban regime mercilessly imposes on its own people decade after decade after decade. As we meet again, yet again, today, sadly, Cuba is plunged back into darkness. Another blackout is sweeping the island. Blackouts have been affecting the island for many, many years. Colleagues, this is sadly nothing new. Families are once again wondering whether their food will spoil, whether hospitals will have power, whether they will have enough charge on their phones to call their loved ones. But somehow, conveniently, there always seems to be enough power for the regime, for the Cuban dictatorship. There's enough power right now as we speak for the Castro family's compounds. They have electricity. There's enough power for the regime's offices, including, apparently, enough to type up today's remarks, blaming America once again, year after year, for the crisis they have created. There will be, I promise you, enough power for the Cuban propaganda shop to clip and post and translate their lies they're spreading in this body once again around the world. I stand here today to urge the Cuban regime, change your ways, turn the lights back on for your people. You have heard the cry of your own people. Answer it. Answer that cry. Che Guevara, one of the heroes of the regime, otherwise known as the Butcher of La Cabón, who, oh, by the way, rounded up gay people and sent them to labor camps, he used to say that Cuba's revolutionaries were, quote, guided by love for their people. Where is that love? I don't see that love. 5 years ago, this month, 5 years ago, on July 11th, 2021, thousands of Cubans filled the streets and demanded freedom. You can pound away, my friend. This is not Havana. This is the United States of America. This is the United Nations. And we will speak, we will be heard, and we will not be silenced like your own people. So pound away.
I'm sorry to interrupt the speaker. This is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. Before giving the floor, may I remind the distinguished representative of Cuba that in pursuant to Rule 71, a representative raising to a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. I call for you to call to decorum the permanent representative of the United States. This is the United Nations General Assembly. You are a liar, Mr. Waltz.
Your remarks will be reflected in the record of this meeting. I also appeal to members to confirm with the practice of the United Nations whereby debates are conducted in a respectful manner. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States of America to continue.
Mr. President, here's what the regime and their very rude and inappropriate representatives do not want you to hear. That 5 years ago, this month, this anniversary is coming up, thousands of their people filled the streets of Cuba and demanded their freedom. They were hungry, they were tired, they are living through years of blackouts, they are sick of a regime that sits on billions while its people starve. For 67 years, the Cuban regime has enriched itself, its ruling elites, while abusing its people, strangling private enterprise, criminalizing dissent, and clinging to failed communist economics. Colleagues, communism has never worked, it doesn't work, and it will not work. And when the Cuban people demanded something better, something different, to have a voice, the regime could choose to listen, but it did not. Instead, it chose to imprison 800 of its own people. And I want to take a moment today to read a few of their names. You should hear their names. You should see their faces. Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara. You know what his crime was? He's in maximum security prison. His crime, and this is according to the regime, is, quote, artistic expression. His crime is being an artist, Mr. President. Fernando Almenarez Rivera. His crime, He's a musician, and he writes songs the regime doesn't like, calling for freedom. Mikel Castillo Perez, another musician in maximum security prison. What did he do? He also wrote rap songs the regime doesn't like. This young man, this amazing young man, Duanes de Bel Leon Tobera, is a young poet. He's a poet. Security prison. And these two brothers, Jorge Martin, Nadir Martin Perdomo, the UN, you all, have condemned their imprisonment and called for their release. See their faces as you make your speeches today. Remember them, because they're in prison for daring for freedom. Colleagues, they're not armed, they're not violent, they carry flowers and write poems and write music. And for that, the regime beats them, detains them, and tries to break them. These are the names the delegation here banging on the table doesn't want you to hear. They don't want this assembly to hear it. They don't like free speech. They don't like dissent. And instead, year after year, they hide behind this myth called a blockade. But let's talk about this so-called blockade. I would ask you if there's an embargo, and I'm looking at some of the delegations here. If there's an embargo, a blockade, whatever name they want to put on it, how did humanitarian aid from Belize, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, the European Union, Mexico, Spain, Russia, Uruguay, and the UN itself reach the country just in the last few months? Many of you have mentioned a massive Russian oil tanker with 750,000 barrels of oil just went to the island. There's a humanitarian aid provision in our law for humanitarian aid. There is no ring of Navy warships, U.S. Navy warships, sitting around this island blocking trade or humanitarian aid going into Cuba. It's fake, it's false, it's a lie. Period. If there's an embargo, why does the United States, I'm a native Floridian, I've seen the ships leaving our ports, give $500 million a year in commodities to Cuba? Why is the U.S. providing more than $100 million in aid? I've heard other countries giving aid today, spread over a decade, a few $1 $100 million just this year in aid, also working with the Vatican and the Catholic Church to deliver food and medicine to the needy. Aid that we also provided, additional aid after the most recent hurricane. And I ask you, I go back to the fundamental question. If there's no food and fuel for hospitals, how is there fuel for the Castro private family jet? How does President Diaz-Canel afford, you can look it up online, his Hermes tie? How does he afford his Rolex watch and the Mont Blanc pen that he writes with? How does the Castro family afford their 17 homes, their private island, their splashy trips to Madrid and Moscow and the Costa del Sol?
I'm sorry to interrupt the speaker once again. There is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. But let me just remind the delegation of Cuba and all delegations, in fact, a delegation can exercise the right of reply at the end of this of the afternoon meeting. So I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba if he has a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is a procedural matter. The delegation which opposed and asked for this debate to not take place has taken the floor twice, and it is doing so now in an offensive way against my country, and I call upon you to call upon the Speaker to observe decorum. Thank you.
Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I just will have to say as an aside that the truth hurts and the truth isn't disrespectful. I'm sorry you don't want to hear it, the delegation from Cuba. But here's the part, colleagues, they're really not going to want to hear. This is an organization called GAISA. This is the Cuban military's secretive conglomerate that runs about half the Cuban economy. It has an $18 billion trust fund. I would hope you would all ask yourselves, particularly those that are contributing, where's all the money going? Where is all of that money? $18 billion under GAISA. If you haven't heard of it, it doesn't give a cent of those earnings to the Cuban people. We should also be talking about Cuba's modern-day slave trade. Yes, the Cuban regime ships doctors and nurses around the world and around the region, but here's the part they don't tell you, and they want to bang the table so that you don't hear. The regime takes their wages. They don't get paid. The regime takes the wages and makes them work for free and threatens their families if they disobey. And they do the same with the mercenaries. My European colleagues, please hear this. Thousands of Cuban men are being forced to fight in Ukraine. And do you know where their wages are going? In the Castro family pockets. They're going to the regime. So I question how you can stand here as you take the position that you've taken on Ukraine and not condemn the Cuban regime for sending mercenaries there. It is no wonder, with what I've laid out today, that nearly 2 million Cubans have risked their lives and fled. And where do they flee? They often go to the United States. We have now 3 million Cuban Americans who are proudly thriving as entrepreneurs, as business owners, as lawyers, as doctors, as members of their communities. Even our own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a Cuban American who has risen through our society to represent the United States on the world stage. In contrast, Cuban Christians have been persecuted, dissidents are sent to labor camps, Afro-Cubans are rounded up, and anyone who speaks out pays the ultimate price. So we have to ask ourselves, why does Cuba continue to call for this debate and come to this microphone? The answer is simple, because blaming the United States is the only economic plan Havana has left. And when they try to whitewash their crimes, again, for the second time in one session at the cost of $28,000 per hour, don't fall for it. Don't lend your voice to this propaganda. There is no American blockade. The only embargo in Cuba is the guillotine the regime keeps over the heads of its people. And when the Cuban regime keeps feeding their people in the world these lies, they would do well to remember Fidel Castro's own words. He said, quote, "Deceiving the people, raising false hopes, always brings the worst consequences." Well, the consequences are being felt by the Cuban people year after year after year. And what are those consequences? They are years of blackouts, a population that hates its government, empty grocery shelves, broken hospitals, and millions of Cubans who have fled the island that they love. I ask you again, we heard the foreign minister of Cuba describe the United States as racist and oppressive. Why are so many people trying to come to this country? Why are so many people fleeing their country? The world should not help the Cuban regime hide its incompetence and its malice and its corruption and its greed. We should help the Cuban people break free, realize the freedoms that the Cuban people have dreamt of for so long. I stand with the Cuban people. President Trump stands with the Cuban people. Secretary Marco Rubio, a proud Cuban American, stands with the Cuban people. We call on the regime to release these political prisoners, to allow real economic freedom, and give the Cuban people the very rights that this body claims to defend. Stand with the Cuban people. Do not stand with the regime that has broken that country. You cannot do both. Now is a time for choosing. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States of America. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States objects to the General Assembly holding a second debate on this topic during the 80th session. Now, many of you in this room know me as the budget guy, so I could tell you how the $28,000 an hour we're spending today is wasteful. With the $84,000 this meeting will cost for 3 hours, and we all know it's going to go beyond 3 hours, we could feed 3,500 Cuban children for a month. We could provide emergency health kits for 40,000 people for 3 months. We could buy more than 1,600 solar lanterns for families sitting in the dark and wheel in thousands of sacks of rice, beans, and grain. We could even cover more than 400 years of the average Cuban's annual salary. But something far more dangerous than wasteful spending is happening here. Havana calls this meeting year after year, and now twice in one session, because it wants to make this assembly complicit in its machinery of repression. It wants the UN to bite another propaganda clip. It wants to use your voices and your silence to show the world that a brutal communist dictatorship can keep polite company. It can enrich itself, starve its people, send dissidents to prison, exploit slave labor around the world, play the victim, and still get applause here in New York. Right now, Cuba is in darkness, again. The island has been under a nationwide blackout since yesterday, and no doubt the regime will note that nearly 10 million people are affected. But wherever the few working generators are on the island, I can assure you that they are not powering the cells of political prisoners. They are not powering a Cuban family's refrigerators. They are not powering a hospital ward full of patients waiting on medicine, oxygen, or surgery. I urge the Cuban regime, turn the lights back on for your people. Because some of those generators are powering regime offices. They are powering Havana's propaganda shop. They are powering cronies watching this meeting right now, ready to clip it, post it, translate it, and spread their lies anywhere those lies can find harbor. That is why Havana wants this meeting. Not to solve its economic failures, not to save its people from hunger. Let's not kid ourselves, colleagues. Havana is here to manufacture content, and it will do that today not by helping Cubans or honestly highlighting their plight, but by blaming the United States. And while this assembly hands them another microphone, what are we not talking about? We are not talking about the more than 800 political prisoners held by the Cuban regime. Do they have electricity today? Fans in their cells? Phones? Outlets to charge them? Do their families have electricity to wait for one call that might come? Do they have light to read, write, pray, and survive? Or are they sitting in darkness while regime officials prepare talking points for New York?
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Colleagues, that is the real Cuban embargo.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt the Speaker. There is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I understand that at this time the General Assembly of the United Nations is considering whether it is to open a debate with regard to the issue, namely the necessity of ending the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. And at this time, as I understand it, the Assembly is simply going through a procedural item with regard to whether the debate is opened or whether it is not opened. I am surprised that the presidency of the General Assembly has not called to order the delegate of the United States of America, who is making a substantive intervention which in no way is procedural in nature. I really do request that you call the delegate to order. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States of America to continue.
Mr. President. And while this assembly hands them another microphone, what are we not talking? We are not talking about the more than 800 political prisoners held by the Cuban regime. Do they have electricity today? Fans in their cells? Phones? Outlets to charge them? Do their families have electricity to wait for the one call that may come? Do they have light to read, write, pray, and survive? Or are they sitting in darkness while regime officials prepare talking points here in New York? Colleagues, that is the real Cuban embargo. It is not the one Havana pretends exists. It is the embargo the regime imposes on its own people, on speech, on faith, on enterprise, on dissent, on political rights and hope, and now, quite literally, on light. So ask yourselves, what exactly are we doing here? Will this meeting release Cuba's political prisoners? Will it return the stolen wages of Cuban doctors shipped abroad? Will it stop Gaesa from sitting on billions while Cuban families go hungry? The answer is no. It will give a brutal communist regime another clip, another post. Keep banging away. It's very effective. It will give a brutal communist regime another clip. Keep going, my friend. Another post, another propaganda splash.
I'm sorry to interrupt the Speaker from the United States. There is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Gracias, señor. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm surprised that Your Excellency is recalling to me what the rules of procedure of this General Assembly are. I'd like to ask you and the Secretariat about which basis are you taking from the rules of procedure of the General Assembly to proceed at this moment to allow a substantive debate without the General Assembly having agreed to open the debate? I'd like to remind you, President, that in adherence to the rules of procedure of the General Assembly, the General Assembly can only open and reopen the item necessity of ending the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. That is the issue. The only thing that we are discussing is whether we open this. The Assembly still has not decided whether or not they're going to have a debate on this. So I'd like you to explain to the Assembly exactly which rule of procedure you're basing yourself on as you are inadequately conducting this meeting with allowing the US to speak in this way. And I do object that this behavior continue. I'd like to ask, President, Has the Assembly already agreed to hold the debate, or has it not yet approved opening the debate? If it has not yet approved it, then there should not be a debate until such time as it does. So I would like you to ask the General Assembly whether or not there should be a debate during this session on this item. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba, and also I would like to remind everyone that the United States is explaining their objection to the proposal. I now give the floor back to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. So ask yourselves, colleagues, what exactly are we doing here? Will this meeting release Cuba's political prisoners? Will it return the stolen wages of Cuban doctors shipped abroad? Will it stop Gaesa from sitting on billions while Cuban families go hungry? The answer is no. It will give a brutal communist regime another clip, another post, another propaganda splash. And this assembly should not be in that business, especially not during UN 80. We are supposed to be getting back this institution back to basics. This meeting does none of that. It does not deliver aid. It does not defend human rights. It does not help the Cuban people. The Cuban regime already gets one annual whitewashing spectacle in this body. One was already too many. Two, helps validate the critics who see this body as fundamentally unserious. So the United States calls for a vote on whether to proceed. We urge delegations to vote no. Stand with the Cuban people, not with the regime that oppresses them. I thank you.